There is a sound a room makes right before someone destroys you. A kind of silence that isn't peace. It's the silence before a storm decides where to strike. I heard that silence on a Tuesday morning, standing in my father's living room, wearing my dress blues for the first time in front of him. And in that silence, my father looked at me, the daughter he raised, the daughter he once called his proudest achievement, and he said one word that broke something in me that has never fully healed. Traitor. That's what he called me. Not disappointed, not confused. Traitor. As if I had sold secrets to an enemy nation, as if I had betrayed my country. But all I had done, the only thing I had done, was tell the truth. My name is Sarah Whitfield, and before I tell you what happened on the day an admiral said 3 words that made my father freeze like a statue in front of 200 people, I need you to understand who I was before that day. Because this isn't just a story about betrayal. It's a story about what happens when doing the right thing costs you everything you love, and what happens when the truth, no matter how long it takes, finally comes home. I grew up on Navy bases, Norfolk, San Diego, Pearl Harbor, wherever my father was stationed. My father, Captain Daniel Whitfield, was not just a Navy officer. He was the Navy. It ran in his blood the way some men have music in theirs. He used to tell me when I was small enough to sit on his shoulders during the flag ceremonies that honor wasn't something you talked about. It was something you did quietly, even when nobody was watching. I believed him. I believed every word. That's the tragedy of it, really. I believed him so completely that I built my entire life around those words. When other girls in high school were deciding between colleges and boyfriends and what dress to wear to prom, I was studying navigation charts and running before dawn, training my body and my mind for the Naval Academy. I wanted, more than anything on this earth, to make my father proud. I wanted to be a Whitfield the way he understood the name. Steady, honorable, loyal to the uniform. I remember the summer before I applied sitting on our porch in Norfolk, watching the destroyers move slowly across the harbor in the distance, gray shapes against a gray sky. My father sat beside me with 2 cups of coffee, and he told me, in the plain, unhurried way he told most important things, about the first time he stood on a ship's deck as a young ensign and felt, for the first time in his life, like he belonged to something bigger than himself. That feeling, he said, is worth more than any paycheck, any rank, any medal. Once you have it, you protect it, no matter what it costs you. I didn't understand then how heavy those words would become. I only knew, at 17, that I wanted that feeling too, the feeling of belonging to something worth protecting. I got into Annapolis. My father cried when the acceptance letter came, the only time I ever saw him cry before that terrible Tuesday. He hugged me so hard I couldn't breathe, and he whispered into my hair, "You're going to make this family proud, Sarah. You're going to carry this forward." I carried it. God, I carried it. 4 years of discipline that broke most people who tried it. I graduated in the top of my class. I commissioned as an officer. And I was assigned, by what felt at the time like destiny, to the same fleet where my father's closest friend, a man I had called Uncle Marcus my entire childhood, served as a senior commanding officer. Rear Admiral Marcus Reyes was not just my father's colleague. He was his best friend of 30 years. They had gone through flight school together, weathered deployments together, stood as best man at each other's weddings. Marcus Reyes had held me as a baby. He had taught me how to tie a proper knot when I was 7 years old, sitting on the dock at Norfolk with more patience than my own father ever had. To me, he wasn't just an admiral. He was family. So when I was assigned to a logistics oversight role under his command, my father was overjoyed. "You'll learn from the best," he told me on the phone, his voice thick with pride. "Marcus will look after you." Marcus had a laugh that filled a room, the kind of laugh that made even the most exhausted sailors on a long deployment relax, if only for a moment. He remembered birthdays. He remembered the names of spouses and children, even ones he had only met once. At my academy graduation, he stood next to my father with the same proud tears in his eyes, and he told me, gripping my shoulders with both hands, "Sarah Whitfield, you're going to do great things. I've known it since you were 7 years old." Sitting on that dock, refusing to give up until you got that knot right. I believed him completely. I had no reason not to. But what I didn't know that day, what none of us knew, was that the man my father trusted more than almost anyone alive was already, quietly, destroying lives. I want to be careful here, because I loved Marcus Reyes. I need you to understand that this isn't a story about hating a villain. It's a story about how the people closest to us can hide the deepest cracks, and how loving someone doesn't mean you get to look away from what they've done. It started small, a discrepancy in a supply contract, a shipment of protective equipment that didn't match its paperwork. As a junior logistics officer, my job was to notice things like this, to flag them quietly so someone above me could investigate. I flagged it the way I was trained to. I filed the report the way protocol demanded. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the worst year of my life. Because 2 weeks later, I was called into a private office and Rear Admiral Marcus Reyes, Uncle Marcus, the man who taught me to tie knots on a dock in Norfolk, looked at me across his desk with eyes I had never seen before. Cold, calculating, nothing like the warmth I remembered from childhood. "Sarah," he said, "you're a smart girl. Smart enough to know that some things are bigger than a paperwork error. Smart enough to let this go." I remember sitting very still, my hands folded in my lap, my heart pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. Because in that moment I understood, not with words, but with a cold certainty that settled into my bones, that this wasn't a mistake. This was a cover-up. And the man asking me to look away wasn't just my commanding officer. He was the man my father trusted with his life. I said nothing that day. I walked out of that office in a daze, and I sat alone in my quarters that night, staring at the wall, trying to convince myself I had misunderstood. Trying to convince myself that Uncle Marcus, the man who had wiped my tears at my grandfather's funeral, could not possibly be capable of what I feared he was hiding. But something inside me, something my father himself had planted there all those years ago on his shoulders during flag ceremonies, would not let it go. Honor wasn't something you talked about. It was something you did, quietly, even when nobody was watching. So quietly, I began to look closer. Part 2. The betrayal. What I found over the next 4 months nearly broke me. The supply discrepancy wasn't an accident. It was the surface of something much larger, a pattern of falsified safety inspection reports tied to a private contractor who had been cutting corners on protective equipment for years. Equipment meant for sailors on active deployment. Equipment that had already failed once, in a training incident that had injured 2 young enlisted men and had been quietly buried in paperwork, labeled as equipment malfunction, cause undetermined. I found emails. I found signatures on inspection reports that didn't match the actual inspection dates. I found a paper trail that led, again and again, back to authorizations personally approved by Rear Admiral Marcus Reyes. Every night, I sat with what I had found, and every night, I thought about my father. I thought about how he would react. I thought about 30 years of friendship, about weddings and deployments, and the man who had been there for every important moment of my father's life. I thought about what it would mean to bring this forward, not just for Marcus, but for my father's entire world. I want to tell you I was brave. I want to tell you I marched forward without fear. But that would be a lie, and this story deserves the truth. I was terrified. I lost weight. I stopped sleeping through the night. I would wake up at 3 a.m. with my heart racing, staring at the ceiling of my quarters, asking myself the same question over and over. What do I do with the truth when the truth will destroy the people I love? But then I would think of those 2 enlisted men, injured because equipment failed when it shouldn't have. I would think of every sailor still wearing that same faulty gear, trusting that someone above them had done their job. I would think of my father's own words, echoing back at me from childhood. Honor is something you do, quietly, even when nobody is watching. He had taught me this. He had built this exact conviction inside me with his own hands, and now that conviction was going to cost me everything he loved. There was a night, about a week before I filed the report, when I almost didn't. I sat in my car in an empty parking lot near the base, engine off, staring at a printed copy of everything I had found, and I imagined every possible outcome. I imagined Marcus laughing it off, calling me dramatic, and everyone believing him instead of me. I imagined my father's face when he found out. I imagined a version of my life where I simply put the folder in a drawer, transferred to a different command, and let it become someone else's problem. That version of my life would have been so much easier. Nobody would have called me a traitor. Nobody would have looked at me differently in the hallway. But then I thought about a young sailor I had met only once, during a routine inspection. A boy barely 20 years old, proud of his uniform, eager to prove himself, trusting completely that the equipment issued to him had been checked and approved by people who cared whether he came home safely. I thought about his face, and I closed the folder, and I drove to my quarters, and I filed the report the next morning before I could talk myself out of it again. I filed a formal report with the Naval Inspector General's office. I documented everything: the falsified reports, the pattern of approvals, the buried incident from the training accident. I submitted it through proper channels exactly as I had been trained. I did not go to the press. I did not make a public spectacle. I did what my father raised me to believe was right, quietly through the proper chain, trusting the system to do its job. Within a week, the investigation began. Within 3 weeks, my life fell apart. Word travels fast in a tight-knit military community, and word travels faster when the person under investigation is beloved. A decorated Rear Admiral with 30 years of service and a reputation as untouchable as granite. Before the investigation had even concluded, before a single formal finding had been announced, the story that spread through the base wasn't about falsified safety reports. It was about a junior officer, me, who had gone after a respected admiral, who had turned on her own, who had, in the words that eventually reached my father, betrayed a man who had been like an uncle to her over paperwork. My father called me that week. I will never forget the sound of his voice. Not the warm voice I grew up with, but something sharper, something I had never heard directed at me before. "Sarah, what have you done?" I tried to explain. I tried to tell him about the falsified reports, about the injured sailors, about the truth I had found buried under 30 years of trust. But he wasn't listening to explain. He was listening to confirm what he had already decided to believe. "Marcus has served this country for 30 years, he said, his voice shaking with a fury I had never heard from him. "He gave everything to the Navy. And you, my own daughter, you tried to destroy him over a paperwork technicality?" "Dad, it's not a technicality. People got hurt. It could have been worse." "Don't!" He cut me off. "Don't you dare stand there and tell me you did this for honor. You did this for attention. You did this to make a name for yourself, and you dragged Marcus's name through the mud to do it." I remember standing in my quarters, phone pressed to my ear, feeling something inside my chest crack open. This was the man who had taught me what honor meant. This was the man whose words I had carried like scripture through 4 brutal years at Annapolis. And now those same words, his own words, were the reason I was standing here, and he was calling me a traitor for using them. "I did exactly what you taught me to do," I whispered. "Don't you dare put this on me." The investigation continued for months. It was not quick and it was not easy. Marcus Reyes had allies, powerful ones, and there were moments I genuinely believed the whole thing would be buried, that I would simply become the officer who made trouble and would spend the rest of my career paying for it. I was reassigned to a desk position far from any meaningful responsibility. I was quietly excluded from briefings I should have attended. I watched colleagues who once respected me go silent when I walked into a room. But the worst part, the part that still aches somewhere behind my ribs even now, was my father's silence. Not just his anger, his absence. He did not call. He did not write. When my mother passed a message that she loved me and was praying for me, there was no message from him at all. At Christmas that year, I sat alone in my apartment with a small tree I never bothered to fully decorate, and I understood, with a grief deeper than anything I had felt before, that I had lost my father the same day I had gained my integrity. I want to tell you there was a dramatic breaking point, a single moment where I decided to fight back. But healing rarely comes like that. It came slowly, in small moments, in the quiet resolve of continuing to do my job well, even when no one was watching. In letters from the mother of one of those injured enlisted sailors, thanking me for what I had done, even though I had never met her. In long nights where I stopped asking whether I had done the right thing and started asking instead how I would carry the consequences with my head held high. There was a particular evening near the end of that first winter when I finally stopped waiting for my phone to ring. I remember sitting on the floor of my small apartment, surrounded by the reports and files I had spent months buried in, and I felt something shift inside me. Not happiness exactly, but a kind of quiet steadiness. I realized I had spent an entire year measuring my worth by whether my father approved of me, and for the first time I asked myself a different question. Not, will he forgive me, but can I forgive myself for staying silent if that's the price of his approval? The answer came easily. It always would have. I could survive losing my father's approval. I don't think I could have survived losing my own reflection in the mirror. Because here is what I came to understand. Somewhere in the loneliest months of that year, my father had taught me that honor was something you did quietly, even when nobody was watching. He had never told me that sometimes the people who taught you that lesson would be the very ones who couldn't stand to watch you live it. The investigation concluded 14 months after I filed that first report. The findings were undeniable: a pattern of falsified inspection records, financial irregularities tied to the contractor, and a direct chain of approvals that led to Rear Admiral Marcus Reyes. He did not simply retire quietly, as men in his position so often do. He was formally relieved of command, stripped of honors, and referred for further proceedings. 30 years of service ended not with a ceremony, but with a closed-door hearing and a quiet, humiliating exit. I felt no joy in that. I want you to understand that clearly. There was no triumph in watching a man I had once called Uncle Marcus lose everything. There was only a heavy, complicated grief. Grief for the version of him I remembered from childhood, and grief for what his choices had cost so many people, including me. But something else happened. Something I did not expect. Because the investigation didn't just confirm what I had found, it revealed something more. Buried in the same records, investigators uncovered evidence that the faulty equipment I had flagged was already scheduled for a much larger deployment, one that would have put hundreds of sailors at risk within the next quarter. My initial report, the one my father called a betrayal, the one that cost me a friendship with an admiral, and, for over a year, my relationship with my own father, had stopped that deployment before it happened. I did not know any of this until the day of the ceremony. It was a formal proceeding, months after the case had closed, where a small group of officers were recognized for actions the Navy considered to reflect exceptional integrity under pressure. I almost didn't attend. I told myself it was because of the schedule, but the truth was simpler. I was afraid. Afraid of standing in a room where my father might be present. Afraid of what it would feel like to be honored publicly for the very thing that had cost me his love privately. But he was there. My father was there. Seated near the back, in his dress uniform, his face unreadable. I don't know if he came because he had been informed of what the ceremony was truly about or because attendance was simply expected of men of his rank. I only know that when I saw him across that room, my hands began to shake. The presiding officer that day was Vice Admiral Elena Cross, a woman with a reputation so formidable that rooms went quiet when she entered them. She had overseen the final stages of the investigation herself. And when it came time to speak about my case, she did not read from prepared remarks. She set the paper down, looked directly at the room, and spoke plainly. "Lieutenant Whitfield," she said, filed a report that many people around her discouraged her from filing. She was told, more than once, to let it go. She was warned that pursuing this truth would cost her relationships, her reputation, and possibly her career. She pursued it anyway. And because she did, this Navy discovered a failure that would have put 412 sailors at risk in a deployment scheduled for just 8 weeks after her original report. The room was utterly silent. I could feel my father's eyes on me from across that space, though I did not turn to look at him. "I have served this Navy for 34 years, Admiral Cross continued, "and I have rarely seen an officer show this kind of moral courage at such personal cost. Some of you in this room know exactly what that cost was for her. I think it's time the record reflects the truth." And then, and I will remember this moment for the rest of my life, Admiral Cross turned, looked directly across the room to where my father sat, and she said 3 words that I did not fully understand the weight of until I watched what happened to his face. She saved them. 3 words, that's all it took. She saved them. I watched my father's expression change in real time. The rigid pride, the anger he had carried for over a year, the certainty that his daughter had betrayed a friend for nothing. All of it seemed to drain out of him at once, replaced by something I had never seen on his face before. Shock, realization, and underneath it, something that looked almost like shame. He sat frozen in his seat, unable to move, unable to speak, as the weight of what he had done finally settled over him. His daughter had not betrayed anyone. His daughter had done exactly what he had spent her entire childhood teaching her to do. She had done the right thing, quietly, even when nobody was watching, even when it cost her everything, including him. I did not go to him after the ceremony. I let him sit with it. I let him carry, for once, the same silence I had carried for over a year. He came to me 3 days later. He did not call ahead. He simply appeared at my door, out of uniform, looking older than I remembered, and he stood there for a long moment before he spoke. "I read the full report," he said quietly. "All of it. What Marcus did. What it would have cost. What you gave up to stop it." I said nothing. I let him continue. "I called you a traitor," he said, and his voice broke on the word in a way I had never heard before. "My own daughter. I called you a traitor for being braver than I have ever been." I felt tears I'd been holding back for over a year finally slip free, but I did not run to him. Not yet. Some wounds need to be acknowledged before they can be healed. You taught me what honor was, I told him. You just forgot for a little while what it costs. He nodded, and for the first time since that terrible Tuesday morning, he reached for me. Not with pride this time, but with something humbler. With apology. With the kind of love that admits when it has failed. We are not the same as we were before. Some things, once broken, reshape themselves into something different rather than returning exactly to what they were. But we found our way back to each other, slowly. The way you rebuild anything worth keeping, one honest conversation at a time. In the months that followed, my father started doing something he had never done before. He started asking me questions instead of giving me answers. He asked me what the year had actually felt like, from the inside, rather than assuming he already knew. He asked about the nights I couldn't sleep, about the sailors' families who had quietly thanked me, about the moment in Admiral Cross's ceremony when I saw his face change. He listened in a way I don't think he had ever listened to anyone in his life, and slowly, in that listening, I found something even more valuable than his apology. I found a father who finally saw me not as an extension of his own legacy, but as my own person, with my own convictions, standing on my own 2 feet. At his retirement dinner, 2 years later, he stood up in front of a room full of officers who had known him for decades, and instead of talking about his own career, he talked about mine. He told the story of a daughter who filed a report nobody wanted filed, who lost a friendship, who lost her father's trust for over a year, and who never once, not for a single day, considered taking it back. I used to think honor was something I taught her, he said, his voice unsteady. I was wrong. She reminded me what it actually looks like. I think about that day often. The day an Admiral said 3 words that made my father freeze in front of 200 people. Not because I take satisfaction in his shame, but because of what it taught me about truth. Truth does not need to shout. It does not need to defend itself loudly or beg to be believed. Truth simply waits, patiently, quietly, for the moment it is finally seen. My father called me a traitor because he loved his friend, and love without truth can make even good men blind. But love, when it finally opens its eyes, has the power to say the hardest words a parent can say to a child. I was wrong, and I am proud of you anyway. If there is a lesson in this story, it is simply this. Doing the right thing rarely feels heroic while you are doing it. It feels lonely. It feels uncertain. It feels often like it will cost you everything. But the truth has its own timeline, separate from our fear, separate from the people who doubt us. And sometimes, all it takes to prove that truth was worth the cost is 3 words, spoken at exactly the right moment, by exactly the right person. She saved them. 3 words, a whole year of pain. And finally, after everything, a father who saw his daughter clearly for the very first time. End.